O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Clearing by O.G. Rose. This was inspired by my conversation with Andrew Luber. I very much enjoy speaking with Mr. Luber. He does a lot of work on story, theme, the philosophical ramifications of thinking in terms of story and theme, and how that can be a very useful way by which to approach metaphysics, ontology, epistemology. I always enjoy his contributions at the net. And we were talking the other night, and we got into this kind of topic of systems building in philosophy. There's a piece in Thoughts that will describe the myth of systems building, because I'm increasingly convinced that philosophers very rarely, if ever, are engaged in this systems building that we constantly hear about, like building these kind of giant systems. Now, I don't want to say it never happens, and I don't want to say that the enterprise is necessarily bad, but for me, the word system refers to where you build something on top of something else, on top of something else, on top of something else. It's a very vertical metaphor. And it suggests that if one part of the system is off, the whole thing breaks down. So, for example, in a laptop, there's a lot of machinery, a lot of parts. If one of the parts is off, often the whole laptop won't work. Everything else could be fine, but if one part doesn't work, the whole thing breaks. You know, you can have a tractor, just a single axle can come off and the tractor won't operate, so on and so forth. So system, to me, is a metaphor that suggests that every part is dependent on every other part. And if one is off, the whole thing doesn't work. I think when we think of philosophers as doing this, then we come to believe that as soon as we find a single error in their thought, we can dismiss the whole thing. And indeed, that does seem to be, there might actually be a kind of incentive to think of philosophers as doing systems, because then when you inevitably find a mistake, I mean, what thinker is perfect? It kind of creates the impression that you can dismiss all of them. Whereas if we think instead of philosophers as doing something more horizontal, meaning they have different points, and some of them need the other points, but they can stand alone, and they don't necessarily need everything the philosopher thinks to be right for some of the points to be right, well, then we have to do the work of examining a philosopher on their own terms throughout the whole thing. And that can be quite difficult. So there might be incentive to think that philosophers build systems so that we can more easily dismiss them. You know, even when I look at someone like Aquinas, is the Summa Theologica or Gentilis, are these really systems? I don't know. You know, there's a premise and there's some counter premises. And it goes from there. I don't know if I see a system here. The famous proofs of God could be incorrect, and yet his analysis of angels could still be correct. The ways that the soul operates, his notions of what justice are, and I think again when we think about philosophers as building systems, it kind of creates this feeling of that they're arrogant, that they are overconfident in their abilities. Whereas if we think of philosophers instead noticing things or examining things one at a time, there's not as much hubris in that metaphor. If we instead think about philosophers as making a space in which we can occupy and think according to, if we think of philosophers instead making clearings, to use the language Mr. Luber used, well, then there's something much humbler about that, and something also much more active on our part. When we think of a system, then all we have to do is learn it and see if it works, and then we can, set it and forget it. It works. It's systematic. It just works on its own. We don't really have to think. And that might be another reason why we like that metaphor, because it's much more, at least before postmodernism, when we believed in systems and modernism, it was much nicer to think that these philosophers provided us a blueprint, and then all we had to do was follow it. We didn't really have to think for ourselves so much. Well, then postmodernism comes along, and it doesn't believe in that anymore, and sees how that kind of idea leads to totalitarianism and dehumanizing, so it dismisses philosophy as systems building. But in that, I think it went too far. I don't think philosophers are primarily in the business of systems making. I believe with Mr. Luber that philosophers are often just making clearings, but we got a certain impression of what philosophers are doing based on modernism. Then postmodernism reacted against that modernist dream, and we're still living in the shadow of that postmodern reaction. So indeed, there may have been incentive to want to think that philosophers created systems during modernism, because then if that was true, we didn't have to do as much. We just had to follow the instructions. And then when that turned out to be false, or postmodernism reacted against that, we have been yet to kind of go back and say, well, wait a minute, maybe we were interpreting philosophy wrong during modernism. Maybe this isn't systems building. Maybe this is doing something else. And Mr. Luber is a great reader of Heidegger, and Heidegger emphasizes clearings and openings and how philosophy is in the business of creating clearings. And clearings are very active. When you walk, if you have a forest and I create a clearing, then you can walk into the clearing, but then it's up to you to determine what you do. You still have to be an active element. And again, there may be incentive to think of philosophy during modernism in terms of systems, because we don't want that active element, because freedom is terrifying. That's a personal responsibility that gets into existentialism. The moment there's choice, there's existentialism and there's anxiety. But Heidegger will emphasize this clearing, making a clearing. And Mr. Luber made this great point on the idea of, say, if you take Kant's categorical imperative, don't do something that you wouldn't want to be a universal principle, or you can just kind of connect that with the golden rule, do unto others what you want done to yourself. And he made the point that, Kant is not like literally saying every act you do, every moment think before you do it, would I want this to be a universal principle? Kant is not saying, before you go and drink your coffee, make sure do you want to live in a world where everyone drinks coffee or something like that? That's not what Kant is saying. Really, ethics is, Kant's ethics is creating a clearing. It's an opening in which people can operate. It's a space in which social interaction can occur. It's more of a clearing, if you interact with other people knowing generally that they're going to do to you what they want done to them, then you're open to them in a new way. If you live in a world when the golden rule roughly applies, then you're more open to the people around you. So there's a clearing, an opening for interaction, of which in turn makes you more open to the other person. Because there's a sense in which if they're willing to enter the same clearing that you're in, that says something about them. That means they share your ground. A clearing in a forest has ground, so they share your ground, and ground is a philosophical term. So if someone enters the same clearing as you, such as the categorical imperative, that means they share a similar worldview. They share ground with you, and so it's possible to understand them better. Luber also made the fascinating point that in the past, when people interacted, they would tell you their family lineage, where they came from, their bloodline, but they would also tell you if they were Christian, which is to say that they would share their ground with you. They would say, this is my ground, this is the worldview according to which I think. And they would share that because if you didn't know their ground, then the likelihood of understanding them and how they thought and so on would be very, very low. So people would share their ground with one another. We don't do that anymore, seemingly because after scientism, materialism, we don't really believe in ground. We believe we all have a similar material composition. So I don't need to share. We're all the same species, so we automatically share the same ground because we're the same biological entity. But of course, we all bodily share the same ground. But I think that's been a mistake, because that doesn't mean we metaphysically share the same ground. And Jonathan Pajot will talk about in The Symbolic World the notion that there's this return of the phenomenological, of an emphasis on meaning, of making meaning primary, because there's understanding today that the scientific worldview doesn't tell us enough. It doesn't give us enough ground to organize ourselves. And the very fact that that's occurring, and Pageau actually has an interesting video where he says, the flat earth movement is kind of a movement that suggests at least subconscious hunger to return to a symbolic world where phenomenology is primary. I thought that was quite interesting. But if indeed Pageau is correct, then one will expect a need to share one another's grounds when we interact and when we encounter one another, because people need to know the framework according to which we are operating. And simply knowing that we're part of the same species is not enough to provide a shared hermeneutical world so that we can understand one another. So I thought it was very interesting what Mr. Luber was saying. But anyway, it's very interesting to think of ethics, ontology, aesthetics, all of these things as primarily in the business not of making a system, but creating clearings in which we can all share a ground. And I think clearing is important because ethics has to come along and clear aside our notions of the ethical life, our vague concepts of the ethical life, and give us something more solid, something new. Aesthetics has to come along and clear aside our ideas that, beauty and pleasure are identical and give us a new aesthetical vision, a new aesthetic vision. Same goes with ontology. It has to clear aside our notions of a stable self and say, if we're following Hegel, give us a a dialectical ontoepistemology. And then once we have that, we can share, once we're in that clearing, because we've cleared aside our notions of stable identity, we will now, as a result, stand in a new ground, on a new ground, in a clearing, on a ground in a clearing, that is a result of clearing, that other people can enter into and share with us. And just knowing that those people share a clearing with us helps us create community. And so this is the other thing, like when you think of philosophy as primarily in the business of systems building, well, systems are mechanical, they're inhuman, they don't have anything to do with the human element. So it doesn't really make space in that metaphoric schema for community. But if you start thinking about philosophy as clearing aside notions to create a clearing on which people can share ground and know what ground they stand on, well, that's very communal. That's very other focused. That makes philosophy something in the business of helping the subject, helping the individual be for other, which is very Hegelian. And in this way, if we think of philosophy as clearing, then we can see why philosophy is so good for community. And in fact, in a pluralistic world of radical difference and diversity, without the ability to think, to clear aside our notions of the other, then the possibility of us sharing a space with the other becomes quite low. We're probably going to be captured by political parties, ideology, corporations to make an enemy of the other or to misunderstand the other in line with what benefits the political party. So philosophy, if we really understand it as clearing, it easily is increasingly going to become a necessity for community that isn't mere tribalism, a tribe in a kind of conformist bad way. So if we want community that is deep and meaningful, then it is increasingly going to be the case that philosophy is necessary, and that is the philosophy as clearing, of which Mr. Luber talks about, without which it seems difficult to see how new communities can form. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you, Mr. Luber, for this wonderful discussion that gave rise to this piece.